At 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, something unusual happened. Not in Washington, not on the battlefield, but on a screen. A voice that had spent years defending a political movement suddenly started asking questions. Not small questions, big ones. Questions about leadership, about strategy, about whether something fundamental had changed, and what made it different this time was not who was asking. It was who was listening, because the audience wasn't outsiders. It wasn't critics. It was the core, the base, the people who helped build one of the most powerful political movements in modern American history. And now? Some of them are no longer sure where that movement is going. Tonight, we're not going to repeat headlines. We're going to break something down more carefully. What's actually causing this internal tension? Why certain voices are speaking up now, and what this could mean for the future of the movement itself. Because this isn't just about foreign policy. It's about identity. What changed? For years, the movement was built around a simple, powerful promise. No more endless wars. It wasn't just a slogan repeated at rallies or a line in campaign speeches. It became something deeper than that. It became a belief, a guiding principle that helped define what the movement stood for, and just as importantly, what it stood against. For many supporters, this idea created a clear dividing line. On one side, a political establishment associated with long conflicts overseas, unclear objectives, and years of costly involvement abroad. On the other side, a new approach that promised restraint, focus, and putting national priorities first. That contrast gave the movement clarity, it gave it identity, and for years it held. But then came a moment that complicated that promise. A military escalation involving Iran. Now, no matter where someone stands politically, one thing is hard to ignore. This wasn't a minor development. It wasn't a limited action that came and went without consequence. It quickly became a situation with global implications. Energy markets reacted almost immediately. Oil prices showed volatility. International observers began watching closely. Allies expressed concern, not necessarily in identical ways, but enough to signal that this wasn't just another routine geopolitical event. And suddenly, a movement built on avoiding prolonged conflict found itself connected to a situation that looked more complicated. That's when the internal conversation began to change. Not loudly at first, not dramatically, but quietly. Supporters who had defended previous decisions without hesitation started asking more detailed questions. Not accusations, questions. What is the objective here? How long might this last? What does success actually look like? And underneath all of those questions was one deeper thought. Is this still aligned with what we were promised? That question matters more than any headline, because political movements can absorb criticism from the outside. They can push back, they can dismiss it, they can reframe it. But when the questions come from within, the dynamic changes. And that's exactly what began to happen. At first, it showed up in small ways. A shift in tone, a pause before full support, a willingness to analyze instead of automatically defend. Then, gradually, those quiet questions started becoming more visible. Discussions moved from private conversations to public platforms. Commentary became more nuanced. The language changed. And eventually, what started as quiet uncertainty became something much more noticeable. A public conversation. Not a complete break. Not a unified backlash, but a visible shift. Because once a core belief is tested, not just by opponents, but by reality, the response is never instant. It unfolds, slowly, then all at once. And that's the point we're beginning to see now. The voices speaking out. What makes this moment different is not criticism itself. Every political movement faces criticism. What matters is where it's coming from. This time, the questions are not only coming from opponents, they're coming from within the same ecosystem. Some lawmakers began emphasizing the importance of congressional approval in military decisions, not as an attack, but as a constitutional argument. At the same time, influential media figures started shifting tone. Instead of focusing only on defending policy, they began analyzing it, questioning it, even expressing concern about direction and clarity. Others took a different angle. They asked, who is influencing these decisions? Are long-standing principles still guiding the movement, or is something else shaping outcomes now? These aren't coordinated attacks. They're not coming from one place. That's what makes them powerful. They're organic. And when criticism is organic, it's harder to control. Why this matters. It's tempting to dismiss this as just noise, another political disagreement, but that would miss the bigger picture. This movement was never a single bloc. It was always a coalition of different groups, economic populists, cultural conservatives, and a smaller but deeply committed group focused on non-intervention in foreign policy. That last group is important, because for years they stayed quiet. They compromised. They supported broader goals even when they disagreed on specifics. But now, this issue hits directly at their core belief. And when a core belief is challenged, people don't just debate, they react. That's what we're seeing. Not rebellion, not collapse, but tension. And tension inside a movement is often more important than opposition outside it. The strategy question. Another factor driving this shift is uncertainty. Not just uncertainty about the decision itself, but uncertainty about the strategy behind it. Because in any conflict, no matter the scale, no matter the location, people always come back to the same three questions. What's the objective? What does success actually look like? And how does this end? These questions are not political. They're fundamental. They're the questions that determine whether people feel confident or concerned. When the answers are clear, even difficult decisions can gain support. People may disagree, but they understand the direction. But when those answers are unclear or appear to shift over time, support starts to weaken. Not instantly, but gradually, because uncertainty doesn't create immediate opposition. It creates hesitation, and hesitation, over time, turns into doubt. Some observers have pointed out that the messaging around the situation has evolved. At different moments, different priorities seem to take center stage. At one point, the focus may appear to be deterrence. At another, stability. At another, broader regional impact. The tone has also shifted. Sometimes firm, sometimes reactive, sometimes strategic, and the explanations offered publicly haven't always aligned in a consistent way. Now, it's important to be fair here. Complex situations often involve multiple objectives. Strategies can evolve as new information emerges. Adjustments are not unusual in high-pressure geopolitical environments. But here's where perception becomes critical. Because from the outside, people don't see internal briefings. They don't see classified intelligence. They don't see behind-the-scenes deliberations. What they see is the public version. The statements, the interviews, the announcements. And when those elements don't form a clear, consistent picture, it creates a gap between what might exist internally and what is understood externally. That gap is where uncertainty grows. And in politics, perception matters almost as much as reality. Not because perception replaces reality, but because it shapes how reality is interpreted. People respond to what they can observe. They respond to patterns. They respond to clarity, or the lack of it. If the objective feels defined, support tends to hold. If the path forward feels structured, confidence increases. But if the direction feels unclear, people start asking more questions, not out of opposition, but out of a need for understanding. And once those questions start spreading, they don't stay contained. They move from private conversations to public discussions to broader narratives. At that point, the issue is no longer just about the strategy itself. It's about whether that strategy is being communicated effectively, because even a strong plan can lose support if people don't understand it. And that's where things become fragile, not because of what is happening behind the scenes, but because of how it appears from the outside. Because in the end, people don't react to internal intentions. They react to what they can see. And right now, what they see is still coming into focus. The base is watching. Here's where things get interesting. Because in politics, moments of pressure usually follow a predictable pattern. When leadership is challenged, especially from the outside, the base tends to respond in a very specific way. It rallies. Support becomes louder, more visible, more unified. Criticism is pushed back. Dissent fades into the background, and the overall message becomes stronger, not weaker. We've seen this pattern play out again and again. It's almost instinctive. But this time, the response feels different. Not completely reversed, not dramatically broken, but noticeably more mixed. Some supporters remain fully aligned. They see the situation as justified, necessary, or strategically sound. Others, however, are starting to ask questions. Not hostile questions, not aggressive ones, but thoughtful ones, measured ones, the kind of questions that signal curiosity and concern at the same time. And then there's a third group, the hardest group to define, but possibly the most important, the uncertain. These are not people making strong statements. They're not posting bold opinions. They're not leading debates. They're watching, listening, trying to make sense of what's happening. And that quiet uncertainty is more powerful than it looks, because it doesn't show up immediately. It doesn't dominate headlines. It doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't create instant reactions. But over time, it changes everything. It shifts the tone of conversations. It influences how people interpret new information. It affects how future decisions are received. And slowly, almost invisibly, it begins to reshape the direction of a movement. Because movements are not just built on strong supporters. They're held together by shared confidence, a sense that things are moving in the right direction, that the leadership understands the path forward, that the core principles are still intact. When that confidence is strong, unity follows naturally. But when that confidence starts to soften, even slightly, the structure begins to loosen, not collapse, not break apart, but shift. And that shift is rarely loud at first. It shows up in small ways. A hesitation in conversation, a pause before agreement, a willingness to consider alternative perspectives. Over time, those small changes add up, and what was once automatic support becomes conditional support. What was once unquestioned alignment becomes active evaluation. That doesn't mean the base has turned. It means the base is thinking, observing more closely, paying attention in a different way. And that's a critical moment for any political movement, because once people move from reacting to evaluating, the dynamic changes completely. Leadership is no longer just followed, it's assessed. Decisions are no longer just accepted, they're analyzed. And the direction of the movement is no longer assumed, it's questioned. That doesn't guarantee a fracture, but it does signal something important, that beneath the surface, something is shifting. And once that shift begins, it rarely stays invisible for long. 3 possible paths. So where does this go from here? There are 3 realistic possibilities. 1. Stabilization. The situation cools down. Clear communication emerges. Concerns are addressed. The coalition holds together. This would require strategic clarity, consistent messaging, and visible alignment with core principles. Possible? Yes. Easy? Not necessarily. 2. Escalation. Tensions increase. The situation abroad intensifies. Political pressure rises. In this scenario, support could either consolidate or fracture further. History shows both outcomes are possible. 3. Internal realignment. This is the most subtle, but potentially the most significant. Not a split, not a collapse, but a gradual shift in influence within the movement itself. Different voices gaining weight, different priorities shaping direction, and over time, a slightly different version of the same movement emerging. The real question. At the surface level, people are debating policy. But underneath, there's a deeper question forming. What does this movement stand for now? That question isn't being asked by outsiders. It's being asked by insiders. And once a movement starts asking that question, it doesn't just disappear, it evolves, or it struggles, or it transforms, sometimes all 3. Conclusion. Right now, nothing is fully decided. The situation is still unfolding. Opinions are still forming. But one thing is already clear. The conversation has changed. What used to be quiet disagreement is now open discussion. What used to be assumed unity is now being examined. And what used to be a settled identity is now being questioned. Not destroyed, not abandoned, but tested. And in politics, moments like this matter, because they don't just shape headlines, they shape the future. So the real story isn't just about one decision, it's about what happens next. Will the movement adapt? Will it double down? Or will it redefine itself? We're about to find out.